Friends, hello and welcome to the first full week of our asynchronous study of the Jewish roots of the Lenten season. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope that the first 10-minute video on Ash Wednesday was instructive to get to know me a little bit more, to get to know what I think we should be focusing on in the following 6 weeks together. This week, I'm inviting us to read the introduction to Professor Levine's book and also the first chapter. So that's what we'll be up to this week. I've got a few post-it notes in front of me, both to keep me on track and on time, but also to make sure that I don't forget any of the important themes that I want us to stay alert to as we read this week. From the introduction, there are kind of 3 points that I think we should really be alert to, pay special attention to. The first we've already talked about on Ash Wednesday. The first is to savor each gospel account on its own. Yes, the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, Luke, go together. We'll find a lot of commonality between them, but there is some nuanced distinctions. The gospel according to John, the fourth evangelist, the fourth gospel account, does diverge significantly in some places from the point of view and the message from some of the synoptics. Of course, there are also a lot of overlap, but savoring each gospel for its own account is important to Professor Levine, ought to be important to us. That was point one. The other thing that is easy to say, but really has a depth of meaning behind it, which is to re-emphasize, or to reiterate, I suppose is better, the point that to study the Gospels, to study Jesus, is to study Jewish history. There was no Christianity, right? When Jesus was here, there was what was called the Way, or a Jesus movement in the first century. But to study Jesus, to study these Gospels, is to study a Jewish teacher with a Jewish following in Jewish communities at the temple in Jerusalem. So that's a really important point that we want to remind ourselves of throughout these 6 weeks. The other point that I think is important in the introduction is to remind ourselves at each point that Jesus was executed by Rome. Jesus was ultimately viewed as a revolutionary, as an insurrectionist, as a threat to the Roman stability. He was put to death by Rome. We can't forget that point because Christian anti-Semitism comes from this idea that somehow the Pharisees or Temple Judaism was involved in Jesus' death. We're going to get into the nuanced points of that, but we have to remember that Jesus died on a Roman cross executed by the state of Rome. So those are the things in the introduction that I'd like you to sort of pay special attention to. As you get into the first chapter, here are some things that I want to draw out there. One is to fully appreciate just how busy Jerusalem was for these pilgrimage festivals. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands of people. I read a statistic in one of these books, I don't remember which one I read all the time, that said something like 255,000 animals would be sacrificed on the altar during these pilgrimage festivals. I mean, that's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of animals, tens of thousands of people. What a busy, busy place. So yes, Jesus was drawing a crowd at the triumphal entry, but we have to keep in mind you've got tens of thousands of people streaming into Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals, whether that is Passover, as the synoptics say, or the festival of Shavuot, as seems apparent in John's account. These are busy periods in Jerusalem, and yet the crowd that Jesus drew wasn't perceived as a threat yet to Rome, because they didn't arrest Jesus at this point in time. So that's curious. We ought to stay alert to that. The other thing that I think is important around this triumphal entry that we're learning about is that this Hosanna, that phrase that was yelled out to welcome Jesus by the followers, that is in the Psalms. That pilgrims coming to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals would have sang and chanted those psalms. So that is not anything new or unique to what was happening with Jesus' entry. That was standard practice, that pilgrims coming into the holy city of Jerusalem for a pilgrimage festival would have been singing those psalms. So I think that's important that we keep that in mind. The last post-it note that I have in front of me, the last thing that I want to lift up here, is to understand this kind of evolving image of Jesus. So to see this triumphal entry, what Professor Levine helps us to understand is that by triumphant, we're looking really at righteousness. So living in a way that is in accord with the scriptures of Israel, with the law, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, whatever you want to call them, or just the Old Testament, right? That triumphant was about righteousness, about living in accordance with the law. When we talk about Jesus being meek, that meek, the sort of language and the usage from the Greek, then the Hebrew, then the Aramaic, that stands behind that meekness is to not lord your power over others, as was seen in the Gentiles. By Gentiles, the clearest expression is in the Roman occupation, that lords that power over others in Jerusalem. That is an occupying empire that is pushing down the folks from Jerusalem. So rather than lord your power over others, Jesus is meek, meaning that he is a servant, that he is not lording his power over others. It's important also to stay alert to the fact that gospel writers are intentionally connecting Jesus to David, the sort of preeminent king of Israel, and to Moses, who received the law or the Torah at Mount Sinai. So those connections between David, Moses, and Jesus, the gospel writers are alerting us to that for a very particular and specific reason. They're trying to make sense of Jesus, the teacher. Who is this guy? Is he the Son of Man? If he is the Son of Man, what does that mean? So there's really intentional connection to the prophetic tradition with prophets like Isaiah and Zechariah. There's intentional connection to the giving of the law at Sinai through Moses, especially in John's account around Shavuot, or a festival that does celebrate law giving at Sinai. And we are moving, when we look at Moses and Shavuot, and when we look at Pesach or Passover, that festival, we're looking at the giving of law. We're looking at liberation from enslavement. So those are the themes that are sort of just hovering close to the surface around this season, around Holy Week in particular. So those are the things that I'd like you to stay alert to as you read the introduction and the first chapter. I'll be back with you via email on Wednesday with a discussion board prompt, and I can't wait to see the things that you take out of the text as you read the introduction and the first chapter this week. More soon.